Decentralize all the things. Decentralize all the things.
Hey there! Welcome to the Web3 Summit Decentralize Now podcast series, hosted by the Decentralize All The Things podcast network. This series features discussions about decentralization from the 2018 Web3 Summit held in Berlin, Germany. This is episode 20, our final episode in the Web3 Summit series. In this episode, we sit in on a Fishbowl discussion about the promises and challenges in achieving completely verifiable, yet totally anonymous voting. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
Cool. So if anyone wants to come talk about anonymous voting, join in. We're doing this awesome panel thing. If you haven't seen it, we've been doing it most of the conference. Anyone is welcome to sit up here and be part of the conversation. Yeah. So there'll always be 4 people sitting in 5 chairs. So if someone else comes up, one of the 4 people needs to go back. And but they can, of course, come back, right? So it's just for fun. And if sometimes there's 3 people or sometimes there's 5 people in the chairs, it's okay. But not forever. So if there's 3 people up here, someone needs to jump in, right? Otherwise, it's awkward. So yeah, let's get this party started.
Okay, I don't really know where to start, but I guess I'll start with saying that anonymous voting is just like a merging of a lot of other things, right? Like it's social, it's identity, it's anonymous. It doesn't live on its own, so it's a conversion of a lot of stuff. And we also have very specific ideas of where that comes from. Like we have like a past of how voting works, and now we have completely different tools on how voting can work. So I don't know. I'll just start with that. See if anyone has any take on that.
Can you just go over maybe some more of the history of what you're like, more of that piece? Yeah, or just like people and
History.
I'm thinking about. So, in my case, I am from Catalonia. And 1 year ago, there was a kind of referendum there, which was blocked by the police and by the state. There was a war in the internet. And then at that point, I realized that having a voting system based on blockchain or some kind of distributed peer-to-peer system, it's a need to avoid this kind of censorship. So I started to think how to implement this stuff. I have speak with many people and checked many projects and so on, but as far as I know, there is nothing useful yet nowadays. So yeah, my idea of this panel was to try to invite people to share some ideas regarding this topic. And talking about not making a simple doodle anonymous, but a whole system for a whole country with millions of people, accessible to everybody. How can we achieve this topic? That's my question to everyone here.
My story is similar. Working on the blockchain space, you realize how how things can change, right? And now you find yourself in the middle of this cyber war, and you have to do something. And so that's how eventually we end up together, and we look for solutions that can be done now, right? Like the theory is all very nice, but how many of these, who uses Bitcoin, right? Like if no one's using Bitcoin, how are we gonna use a decentralized voting scheme? So that's why for the last year we just putting all energy trying to figure out mechanisms that can accomplish that as soon as possible. So our focus always been on trying to accelerate that, right? We know that we probably are not the most skilled developers. We need a huge range of skills to build that. But maybe we can be used as we can put all the pieces together to make that happen. So we are on this constant conversation on just yesterday we're on the ZK Snark stock and then the ZK Stark stock, right? And just with an hour of difference, our mind was like blown away, like because like we were like we're jumping gaps in technology. So we want to make that fast, and we need to like decide on what technologies to use and how this can be done, right? So we just want to hear everything that exists. We want to hear ideas. We want to hear like technologies. So that's what I'd like to have that.
Awesome. So I'm from Australia, and I work at a co-working space, and the person who sits right beside me is a gentleman named Max Kay from Secure Vote. He runs a political party in Australia called Flux, and Flux is a beautiful political party with 7,000 members, and if one person gets into the House of Representatives or the Senate, then the 7,000 members vote with issue-based direct democracy. And they accumulate points, and they get to vote, and the elected official is a proxy for the members. And so they've got some beautiful technology in terms of the blind, like the secret ballot. So in terms that I need to be able to confirm that this address has voted, but I need to I need to delineate my vote so people can't coerce me. So in regimes like Russia or dictatorships where they say, well, I can reverse engineer who the votes were, and there is consequences for not voting in particular parties. So there needs to be the delineation between I have voted and abstracted away from what did I vote. And so that secret ballot was traditionally solved with a paper. So the fact that I can go into a booth, and that is how I delineate the fact that I've checked my name off the roll and I put my vote in.
And that sounds like the ideal candidate for a Stark, or as you say, Stark or Stark, because you could prove that someone had voted without revealing what they have voted and still have the results somewhere. And so that's totally possible. I'm wondering what level of anonymous the voting needs to be, like, because you have to prove that the stakeholder is someone who is able to vote in the situation, I guess. Like if you're in a country, you have to actually be a member of the country, not a member of something.
So I think that brings us to like probably the hardest problem we have, which is like who can vote. Like making it anonymously, it is a hard problem, but as you said, like there is technologies for that. But how do you make sure that everyone that can vote can actually vote and no one else in a context where you are under constant like you're in a cyber war, like they won't allow you to do that. How do you create this census? How do you make people?
So there's a few ways. One of the ways is by creating a non-transferable token. So the same way you would go to Medicare or any of the drivers or whatever country you are, you provide your ID, and they transfer you a non-transferable token.
What happens when they don't allow you to have access to this kind of, like, you cannot just go to authority because that's forbidden?
So we have to agree that this voting is legitimate, right?
I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, under the circumstances that we were, like in the case of Spain, like they did not allow, they were forbidding voting, right? So you need now a mechanism to like make all the citizens to have like an identifier that allow them to vote. How do you do that when they are under like constant like attack, right? Like we're talking about creating decentralized identities, but we're talking about making decentralized identities within like a nation state. So that's what the things start getting a little complicated, because at least from my perspective, there is like conflict or like ideologies, like these two things don't match together.
Yeah, maybe I can explain a bit our first implementation of a voting system. It was mainly an Ethereum network to manage the identity. So there were like individuals or organizations, and organizations can sign claims to individuals. So, for instance, if I'm, I don't know, a cooperative, I can sign a claim saying you are a member of my cooperative, and you have the right to vote, or you are over 18 years old, or something like that. So your identity is a set of claims by the organizations. then this organization can create an election and say only this, for participating on this election, you need to have these claims. So you have to be over 18, blah, 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 blah. Then once the organization click the button for creating a new election, there were a set of servers somewhere that creates a Zcash temporary blockchain, which was only for the election. And it gave one token to each voter. And then the people just make a Zcash transaction to a special ballot address with the content of the vote. And that worked. But there are some problems if you want to apply it to a whole society with real people and so on. The first problem is that ZK snarks are very expensive, CPU intensive. So and there is not there was not a JavaScript or a web-based implementation. So you need a real computer with some Linux kernel or Windows stuff and a desktop application for creating this ZK snark proof and so on. That was the first problem. Another problem is that the system is not very resilient because you need these servers, these special servers, which create this temporary blockchain for voting. So if these servers are attacked, then the election is just not possible. Yeah. So recently we have changed to another. Well, we are like redesigning everything because now there is this JavaScript implementation for ZK snarks from IDEN3 from a company, which is open source, and it makes possible to vote using a phone or a tablet, something like this. But we are still like thinking how to. I mean, is it possible to use a system like that with 10 million people in a one-day election? Is it the blockchain technology prepared for this kind of stuff? I'm not sure of that.
So one of the things as a government, it costs money to throw an election. So every time I throw an election, there's a really important price point. It's a cost per voter, and generally in Australia, it's between $10 to $15. So 21 million people would cost us about $150 million per referendum or vote. And so for these systems to be adopted by a nation state, whether or not it's legitimate or not is another story, they have to be an order of magnitude cheaper. So in my mind, it would have to be the cost of a gas transaction less than 30,000. Like it has to be less than $1 or $2, and then the nation state will pay that because it is cheaper than hosting a traditional election, which costs on average $10 to $15. So I think the technology is beautiful and it has a lot of potential for legitimate nation state that this actually saves a lot of money. The trick is to do it securely, trusted, and all the rest. Yeah, that's my train of thought.
All right. So it's an open question for you guys. I just jumped in because I'm not sure what stage of the conversation you are. So like I've seen a few systems, like a few projects that try to tackle that problem. One I can think of on top of my head is called Agora. They did run an election in, I think, Sierra Leone. And anyway, I'm sure there's several already like trying to solve that election voting issue. Have you guys seen anything interesting, exciting that you think could be used like soon, like let's say in the next 2 to 3 years, or it's just
I don't know exactly Agora, but
I think you refer to Bit Agora, maybe Agora.
We did other research, right? Like that's not something that we want to build because we like building this stuff. Like we want to build because we need it, right? So if there is a technology out there that we can use, we will love to use it. I don't remember that we did like our research. Okay, but our background, like what we saw is like there is nothing really open source that can like fully verifiable and fully decentralized. That's something we need, and like if that exists, like we want to know about it for sure.
Well, I mean, the one that I'm building is for like the Aragon project. Yeah. So they kind of need
on-chain voting because it's like governance on-chain and DAOs on-chain, right? So I mean, I'm just using my scheme is just really aggregate by linear signatures and then one-time MPC setup to to add privacy to bilinear signatures, right? I mean, I chose that because it doesn't require trusted setup. It doesn't require ZK snarks, which have, I mean, like if you're like deep into cryptography, some, exotic assumptions. But I mean, like, like not having to do a one-off blockchain every time, not having to trust an external trusted setup, which may, if that's ever broken, rerunning that ceremony is a pain in the ass, right? And the one-time MPC makes sure that no one ever has toxic waste, right? So that's kind of like my scheme that I'm working on. I think it's easy to do it in like the blockchain context if you're just voting on blockchains. I think if you want to do it for like state elections, I think like a lot of the rest of the world needs to catch up, right? I mean, you can't. I think just saying that we're gonna put elections on behind ZK snarks doesn't really address, like, for example, in Catalonia, if the government really doesn't want a certain thing to happen, like whether there's a like a provable trail that the populace wants, it isn't going to make a difference, in my opinion. Like, you have to sort of disintermediate the government itself, the power of the government first, because otherwise, like, they generally know the people's opinion. They don't care.
First you need a tool, right? Like, when you have the tool, then I think we can start with like politics, right? Like, that doesn't need to be run by a government. Like, just needs to be run with an authority that has enough respect of the civil society, maybe. So you have a lot of margin there.
I don't know how the system you are designing works, but to make an election on-chain and in real time for a real country with 20 million people, I don't know any blockchain technology that can support this. I mean, you need to do it maybe off-chain. Yeah, you don't need a blockchain. That's true. So yeah, then it's off-chain. It's not on-chain.
Just for the closing statement, I mean, you can do the vast majority of the process off-chain and then just like provide the final aggregate on-chain to show that like this. You can do it without ZK snark as well. Just to say, hey, look, something took place. Here's X people voted for this, Y people voted for that, and here's like a final like an aggregate proof that happened. I mean, the 20 million people don't need to all register on the blockchain. That would be crazy. Yeah.
So I just double checked. So the Australian startup that I was talking about did 1.5 billion votes within 24 hours for $550,000. So the Australian government gave them a grant, and they hammered the network for 24 hours and were able to do 1.5 billion votes on chain. It was the Bitcoin network. It's called secure.vote, and they use a Copperfield algorithm. Anonymous votes. It's secret, on-chain, decentralized. And what they did is they batched them in groups of 100, and they had like batch IDs, and then you can say that I voted in a batch, and you can. They did it in batches, and they hammered the network, and they did 1.5 billion votes in 24 hours.
That's interesting. Is it the source somewhere?
Yeah, it's secure.vote. I'm just on my phone, but
okay, I will check.
I just remembered another project that I looked into. So it's called consensus.ai, and it's like the angle I think that was interesting is that the one of the co-founders, like the technical co-founders, is a guy who was heavily involved in e-residency in Estonia. So I don't know if you know what's happening in Estonia. They're like heavily they're like basically the sort of first electronic state. You can basically buy a house remotely. They have electronic signatures and all that business. So like they are like probably the first state in Europe that could adopt that sort of solution, because you say, yeah, we need a solution before finding the political decision to actually vote. But I think you need to find who is the real first adopters, the first users that actually will use the solution. I think it's really important. So like I think that's probably a good angle to look into that project. I know that they had the plan was to first build a system that was usable for a small group of people, for like a small organization, and then sort of scale up from there. I don't know if it's open source. This is something I looked back like some months ago. So, but yeah, that's something another project to look into. Yeah.
Okay, I just arrived, so I might have missed some of the earlier conversations. I think one of like my personal big questions around like online voting and anonymous voting is it like a problem where like the technical part like have we like solved the problem? Because I heard like lots of like very smart people and cryptographers basically say it's a really, really hard thing to get right because there's always very like subtle and complex schemes around like coercion and bribing. To mind comes the example of like dark DAOs that like Phil Dyer and the Cornell University introduced. Again, using some super complex stuff that on chain with DAOs, zero knowledge proofs, to basically do a very efficient bribing and trying to prove that all type of voting on chain, like even aggregating on chain, just couldn't work without this also being able to work. So is that like relevant? Is that like impossible in the real world? Just purely like theory? Is that solved?
I think a lot of these like zero knowledge technologies take a lot of the weight on that. At the same time, the blockchain itself, add this resiliency and it adds a little layer of anonymity as well. Yeah, I mean, at the end, like this is an open source project. Like I think most of like the controversy I've been around digital voting is been like with like terminals and like systems that were like centralized, right? And they were like using like security by obfuscation, stuff like that. We're talking about a completely different system. We're talking about like every single part of the system is fully verifiable, right? So
yeah, I think he was bringing up the fact that if you can vote from home and with a digital signature, right, whatever, if it's zero knowledge or not, then you can provide proof to a third party that you voted for that and get automatic payouts, right? So it's much easier to do mass buy voting.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem intrinsic of any digital system, right? And also an analog. Like there's like buses of old people like just driven like to the voting station, and they give them the paper so they can vote. That's a social problem. I think, yeah.
There's also like very subtle coercion schemes that are made possible with these types of like zero knowledge proofs, and especially online voting, where it's much easier to prove that you did something or not. To analyze, like for example, if you can somehow like get all the votes, and you can only compute that. You don't have the individual votes. But then if you can compute the same thing without like one person and have the result, you can basically deduce what that person voted. And that's a very basic. It goes like much more complex details, which I don't know about. But I know it's often like a critique that is like brought up of these anonymous voting schemes.
I'm not defending these systems are perfect. Like right, like we are at the edge of like a bunch of technologies, all of them at the edge. That's like an exploration, right? Like we're trying to push here to get as much as we can like right now.
I'm really excited about the time delay functions, verifiable delay functions, at hopefully solving some of those problems, at least with timing involved. A question I've had just sitting down there is, in the case of Catalonia, like they didn't let you vote, right? Well, they didn't allow it. So then verifying that you are a member of Catalonia from the government that is there becomes impossible. So I was wondering at technology if there's ways of adding in another validating source that is not the system itself, but it could still validate that these are the people who are able to vote that isn't from that place.
If you have decentralized identities and you can verify the claims of all these identities, then it doesn't matter who said that, right? all you need to do is like, is the authority that is providing these claims trustworthy, right? And at the end, what you need is just to get numbers of like what this community wants, right? And maybe the ex authority that created these elections was not trustworthy, but maybe another one is, or is enough trustworthy, right? All you're trying to do is to prove that you have a majority there, right? As an overall, right? That you can like get precise. At the stage where in Catalonia was just trying to make something very obvious, quantifiable at this last year. So if we can get there, like that's like a huge goal already, right? Then we can get try to get much better from there. But like,
I think there's also possibly a prior step economic solution in Switzerland, for example. Unlike in many other countries, even if you're employed like a salaried employee, you don't pay tax like at source. You just get your paycheck, and then you have to write the government a check at the end of the year, like lump sum for the tax, right? And so it's this. You get, at the end of the year, every year you look at this check you got the government. They're like, is the government really serving my needs for this amount of money that I give them every year? And I think, like in the Catalonia case and whatnot, you could say, fine, if the majority votes in an area votes that they want to secede or they no longer agree with the current government, they don't get the protections, but the tax money does not go to the government anymore, right? I think if you structured the country in that way, the people would have a lot more power, because then suddenly this hundreds of millions is free to do what you want with this seed, and you're not this powerless. It's not like, oh, here's the money. Oh, now please act the way we like. You don't give, like, when I go to the shop and I buy a banana and I already given them the money, they're like, I don't know, how about an orange? It's like, no, give me the banana, give me the money back.
Yeah, that's what in the beginning I was saying, that there is a conflict here because we're proposing a decentralized scheme which is antagonist to the state, right? And that, like, in parallel, and responding to your question previously, like you're saying, like, is that a technological problem? I think no, it's
I was just wondering if the technical problems were solved. It's obviously like much more than that. Yeah. It was just this aspect.
Okay. But like, yeah, the main aspect, the hard problem is a social problem. It's like, how do you make people people could decide not pay taxes, right? That's a huge statement. That changed things. They don't, right? They're like attached to this system. They cannot do that. At the same time, unless you have like I've seen a lot of conversations on governance and how like the signaling is like one of the main issues, right? How you make a decision if you don't have like a signal, like how like a foundation, like a government can make decisions. And voting is nothing but a signaling mechanism, right? And right now the problem is like they have the option to disable the signaling mechanisms. So we're doing here like just putting in place like a signal mechanism that they cannot like block, right? And it may be very bare bones, but it may be enough for people to say, okay, yeah, like now it's clear, and now we can like take like hardcore approaches. But because we have seen, like we have numbers that these things must change, right? And we're talking like very like kind of big numbers, like we're talking about states, but probably like this is gonna start be used like in like small like communities or like small entities, and it's gonna scale up later, right?
Actually, this idea of for the taxes, like you decide if you want to pay the tax and receive something, it's kind of like voting with your taxes or your money. Actually, it's kind of like you choose towards what should they go. Or like if you want to like frame it to crypto ways, like staking towards like to receive something, just you put it towards that. That like could that be developed like further into a scheme where you basically vote with what you want to receive, and especially in the context of like some have thought about that maybe the best way to have good governance is to have more competition in the market for governance. Couldn't that be like another type of voting to be, if you want to be very general?
I love everything you're saying there. That's actually pretty much what I'm trying to do with Giveth. Giveth is all about decentralizing nonprofits, and the largest nonprofits in the world are the Chinese government, India, United States, and that's exactly how the system, the core root of the system is working, where it's like, if you, let's say that there was just keep things simple, no political things here. Let's just say there's like a flat tax of 10%. You have a forced donation, you could say, but you actually have authority over that donation, and you are connected with a delegate. So it's kind of a liquid democracy meets fund management style, right? Where your delegate gets to decide where you go, but you can veto, right? And then you get to actually see exactly where your money goes, right? There's full traceability and accountability through the system. And let's say there's a failed project, but they had $500,000 in the bank. That money would actually go back up a level after the project failed, whatever money hasn't been spent. And then it could be continue to filter through the system, and maybe you'd get access to those funds for vetoing at that point, right? And when you start throwing in this really nice, simple logic, like with blockchain, it makes it just really easy that you could even say, hey, maybe I want like 80% of my money to go towards education. I want 10% to go towards military and 5% to go towards, roads, and another 5% for whatever, right? Slush fund. And then everyone could actually see what the percentage is for all the funds that are being delegated, right? And it's a signal. It's not necessarily guaranteed to be that way, because you could veto, you could pull back your funds, and then you could have someone could see, holy shit, only 10% is going towards the military. That's not enough, like Spain is coming, man. We got to get ready. And then you up that. You're like, I'm going 100%. I'm going all in military, man. Right? I probably wouldn't, but this is like an option.
And I think on the competition thing, most countries' governments are extremely not competitive, and they don't allow any kind of actual solution seeking to problems. Again, like Switzerland is a good counterexample, because in Switzerland, if you as a politician or a policymaker are able to cut the cost of government service, like for example, hey, I cut the cost in half for road repair, but we still repair the same amount of roads. The politician takes half of the cost they saved, and they pocket it, right? And Switzerland is so damn efficient because of this. It's the only country in the G8 or in the Eurozone whose debt has gone down since the last 20 years, every year, right? Roughly. Whereas everyone else goes up. Why? Because when they make sure to run out of budget every year, so they get more budget next year, right? It's a bad incentives. But if you actually align the incentives well, you can actually get competent governors.
I absolutely love both of those ideas. Griff, how do we get there for the idea of governments with deciding the budget and having visibility? Is that like charter cities, experimentation zones, that other stuff?
I mean, what are governments doing? No, like seriously, what do they do? They're just another nonprofit, And there are lots of nonprofits out there. So if we start building nonprofits that perform functions that the governments are supposed to provide, and we give people the option to opt in to these systems, then what do we need these guys for, right? Like, we don't need these fuckers. They just disappear. This is like I gave this talk actually in Switzerland a little bit ago that I really believe we're building an evolution. It's not a revolution. A revolution that's happening in Catalonia right now, that's fucking awesome. I'm all in, okay? But that's not necessarily the blockchain style. At least not the piece I see. I see it as an evolution. I see it as an evolution in human organization. And when systems actually evolve to the point where they're just 10 times better than the other options, it'll just naturally occur that the powers that be won't be the same powers that be anymore. This is my dream, at least.
So in 2016 in Australia, we had a Flux Party. You know what these guys are? Yeah. So I voted for them, and they're awesome. And they do this whole issue-based direct democracy. And so they've got about 7,500 members. And the idea is that if one person gets into either the Senate or to the House of Representatives, then for every issue, you can accumulate points up to 5 tokens. So for issues that matter for you, you can allocate all 5 of your points, or if there's things that you can accumulate, you don't vote for. So the idea is that if you get one person into Parliament, then we can slowly cannibalize that system. So if we get 3 people, then it's a heavier weighted vote in that system. So it's a really interesting way to take over that system using its own mechanism. And so another interesting point that they do that's different is that I could delegate my votes to someone who has a better understanding of. So I could delegate my financial decisions to my accountant, or if I've got an uncle who's in the farm, I can give my agricultural votes.
That's representative democracy, right? It's not working well in states.
No, it's different.
Yeah, so I can delegate my issues depending on different things. So I can vote for same-sex marriage and put 5 votes to that, but then something related to agriculture, I don't really have an opinion, but or my science delegate might accumulate 100 people and they make a more informed decision regarding science and technology or agriculture or treasury and finance.
Yeah, so it's a liquid democracy, and it's a system where you have the ability to take back your votes at any moment. So it is like a representative democracy, except the term limits are indefinite and the elections are every second. So it's like it's similar but different, and you can elect yourself. And so it's like this hybrid between representative democracy and direct democracy. And really quick, I just want to say that what Flux Party is doing is so cool, because they're like, listen, we're just going to elect people that will do whatever their phone says. And so it's like it's a way to hack the system. Yeah, your representative is still you, right? You elect this guy. It's like you're electing your phone or his phone, and he'll just be like the gateway to hack the political system. I love it.
Though I do think having thought about building stuff in the blockchain space for a long time, one very important thing that the government do provide is common law framework. Like when you have to think in an environment without common law framework where there's no one to go after, it's like everything becomes so much harder. And I think that's actually one thing that's that really needs to be centralized. I wouldn't really be comfortable giving the power to prosecute or jail people to arbitrary groups with different interests, right? In this one canton or whatever area of 1,000 people, they decided that wearing the color yellow is illegal. So if I drive through it, I get arrested. If my car is yellow or whatever, I think that's one thing that sort of needs to stay consistent, and that's one thing that governments do actually provide a good value for.
But governments are just made of people, right? So I mean, whether they're using a legal structure that is hundreds of years old and hasn't really anticipated the use of the internet or trains for that matter. I mean, we're talking, how long would it take to send a letter back when this shit was made? You still just have people. For me, you can call it a government, you can call it a blockchain, you can call it whatever, but it's a structure of human organization. And I think it's time that we see some awesome experiments, right? I don't think that unless there's some kind of major issue that we should just be overthrowing governments. That's pretty crazy. But I do think we should be running some real experiments and start upgrading this very old, out-of-date system,
Thank you. So there was a lot of interesting points. So like you mentioned, so there's the government services provided according to your territory, like laws, but then you have some services, I think, that are some sort of like purely practical and kind of irrelevant to your location. So like what I come to is like you already have people who don't really belong to any territory, who live regardless of time of the year at different locations. I don't feel like they belong to any sort of country. And so like these people have the problem of finding basically what government suits them, what sort of system. So that's, I never thought of like your point of view about like government is just a charity, or not a charity, a non-profit, sorry. I think that was really good insight. I never thought of it like that. And this, in that sense, this really resonates with those people who basically they look for a good non-profit that has a sort of framework that works for them or that they like. And so then the problem is that how do you link that to actual locations? Because you sort of have to, like, this problem is that then you have people who 1 month live in one place, 1 month in another, but they're registered in somewhere else because somehow it's more convenient. And then it's not long-term, it cannot work long-term because the country where they're at, they're using the services, right? So how can that be solved? You know, that's really, I think, the problem.
Well, I think, yes, the governments are non-profits, but they also have the monopoly of the violence, and that makes it a very special kind of non-profits. And that make it like, you know, you will never have like this kind of location agnostic government that can fulfill your needs, right? Like, understanding governance as someone that have the monopoly of violence, because that's purely location-based thing. But I wanted, like, we kind of went away from voting and went to governance, and I think that's logical because, you know, yeah, like somehow I believe that voting it's not a good tool. Like it's the best tool we have in the system we have right now. So when we're building a voting system, what we're trying to do here, at least my approach here is like, I don't think that's like the ultimate system, but it's like a statement. Like what we're trying to do here is like statement saying that, hey, civil society can decide by themselves. Hey, we don't need anyone that say, hey, you can vote or you cannot. Like we're doing here, like it's an idea that we want to share, right? And having the option of like anyone coming saying, I want to create an election and say, choose who can vote, and say like full Catalonia. And then suddenly everyone can vote. Like that's a huge statement, right? And for me, that's the magical point here. That's where we want to go. Like I don't think voting's like at least the classical voting scheme is any good. Like I think it's awful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. But at the same time, we got to remember like general design theory. If we want to get to a place where we have like this awesome, who knows, curation market for laws or some crazy like, you know, governance theory, we got to go one step at a time. You can't just have a whole populace and onboard them to this like mind-blowingly awesome application, expect them to use it, because they won't. Like if Facebook adds a feature, they add one feature and they change it one step at a time. So we need anonymous voting because that's what we have now. We need to model it. It needs to be the exact same. People need to have voter registration cards. They need to be able to...
It needs to be mobile friendly. I need to be able to do it from home, and it should just be non-trivial. Like it should...
Yeah, we should give those options, but at the same time, you know, our grandmas are not going to just dive into their phone and be like, "Oh, this is cool. I'm gonna." No, there needs to be a voter card. They need to go to the same school that they go to vote. They need otherwise adoption of that system. Like if we're talking, let's implement this in the next decade. It needs to start out add some cool optional features, but it needs to be designed. In my opinion, it needs to be designed the exact same as it is now, and for better or worse. And then it can start to evolve, and people can start experimenting. But yeah.
perfect example because if I'm lazy, if the government sends me an email saying if I go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and scan my QR code and I can vote, I would love to do that because then I'm lazy, I can do it at home. But the idea that we vote every 3.5 years for this two-party system, that this one elected party represents all of my values and morals, and they might agree with 70% of my morals, but 30%, they go against something completely wrong, and I go for the other party so the whole notion that I vote once for every 3 years is flawed. I definitely think that mobile technology with blockchain and anonymous voting can solve these problems. If I want to vote for more than one issue, I should be able to. If I want to put more than weight to certain issues, I should be able to. And I think we will get that, and I think it will be enabled and it will be opt-in because of early adopters, and they have this app that can vote for them for this party. So I think it's coming. I just can't wait.
Do you know if Flux has some kind of anonymity feature?
Totally, yeah. So it's totally anonymous. It's a secret ballot. It prevents man in the middle. It's got a whole bunch of features, and it's designed for governments. It's not centralized. It's decentralized. Yeah. So it's you just submit a transaction to the blockchain, and it's blockchain agnostic.
No, I have been looking for this kind of solution for a long time, and it's crazy when you ask to the people that it exists. There are so many that I are now and working, and it's like what I have been losing my time.
I wish I knew more. I'm sorry, I'm trying to share what I know.
But I mean, this one that you talked about before, I didn't find the code, for instance. So maybe it's not open source. Maybe the code is nowhere. I mean, the web is a fancy web with a lot of nice stuff, but we really need an open source, free software, anonymous, decentralized voting system. I think it doesn't exist anywhere. I mean, please tell me I'm wrong.
No, we need it. I agree.
Okay, it's on slightly another topic, but you were just talking about the problem of electing someone or some people for 3 years. I think that's mostly a problem. It's very bad information aggregation. It's very, very bad at just showing our preferences. But if, in case we have those solutions that work, so that's a step further. In case we have those solutions that work, thinking about how to aggregate information, since we since these are supposed to solve kind of the identity problem, you can't just duplicate your identity to vote more. What are your thoughts on quadratic voting as a better way to aggregate information? I can explain if you don't see what that is. Okay, to explain quadratic voting, it has become quite popular in the crypto space since the Radical Markets book from Glenn Whale. And the basic idea is everyone gets the same number of vote credits, let's say 1,000. And for each issue, people are free to vote, but they can't actually buy many votes on the issue. The thing is, the first vote costs 1, second one is going to cost 4, and the cost goes up in a quadratic way, which makes it very quickly very expensive to buy many votes. But still, it allows you to express, for example, a strong preference in a certain direction for certain issues. And the goal is to enable minorities to express themselves much stronger on issues that they are concerned with. And for the people that are just not concerned, they can basically not vote. So it's a much more flexible way. The main problem with this is if you, for example, use a system on a blockchain, is you really need a very strong identity system. Otherwise, someone can just duplicate billions of identities and vote once every time.
So we're doing a trial in New South Wales at the moment where they're putting your driver's license on the blockchain. So what they've found is that people were forging driver's licenses, and the same way you can't forge a Bitcoin, you can't forge your QR code. And so they're generating a trial where they do your driver's license on the blockchain. So if you can imagine that your driver's license is a form of identity, then you can attribute that to your vote.
Yeah, I think quadratic voting it's awesome. It's something you can experiment, and when you have a tool like that, like adding something like this is trivial, right? Like, but first we need like the base layer that allows you to just vote, right? Then you can start like building all sorts of like structures and hierarchies and like quadratic voting or even liquid democracy. Like it's something built on top of that, right? But we need the base systems as default. And regarding identity, if you use decentralized identity, like this comes for free. Like all you need to do is trust an authority, and this authority is who decides the census is. So it just makes the claims necessary to like the identities that can vote, right? Like there's no way you can like, I mean, as far as I know.
Yeah, I mean, for the decentralized identity, like usually you're like free to have many different identifiers, like pseudonyms and stuff. So yeah, you either like you do need to trust some authority to, for example, like put an official document that certifies, okay, I'm just like one person and I can create other identities with that. That's one way to work. To kind of go like maybe like slightly see what could be possible otherwise. One interesting scheme was introduced. I can't remember which project introduced that. But if you have like, your digital identity, like lots of data about yourself, like lots of claims signed by other people, if you can like do private computation on that, it could be possible to try and establish like what's like real data and just like a faked identity that's kind of been generated. It's probably a really hard problem, but that may be the only like decentralized way to provide like civil control on the identity layer.
Like identity doesn't need to be public. Now this is what it's easy to do, but it doesn't need to be public, right? It can be private. And using zero knowledge technologies, you can prove stuff without showing what it is, right? So maybe the first implementations are like not that ideal, but there is no like intrinsic problem there that can't be solved, I think.
So is there any hope for identity and voting that's not tied to the one person, one vote thing, but by some other metric like that fits well with the idea in Ethereum that you can just generate many addresses for yourself, but still how I could use this system to express a vote and I wouldn't be like, just spamming the system with my many accounts, but that there was some way to feel the weight behind my vote without it being tied to like this person. I guess by weight, right now our votes are weighted by this idea that everyone is equal, and so therefore we should all have one vote for this thing. But unless we have a very good identity system between like, oh, this person is this address and that's their one vote, then that one person weight and like everyone is equal that falls down. So how else might we be able to think of the idea in a system where everyone can just create an address? I was just wondering for the group, has anybody thought about this and how else we might be able to express a vote without depending on that individuality thing.
No, I just want to add just a small point. There's in Ethereum, there's a standard that's being worked on. It's ERC 725, I think. It's created by the same guy who created ERC 20. And it's this kind of identity that you were mentioning before, where essentially one address can make a bunch of claims about the other address, and as long as you trust that other address, you can trust all those claims about this other guy. That's actually already happening.
That's what we use for our first implementation. We use a 725 and a 735. Those are like basic building blocks for identity. Like they represent what decentralized identity is. And within this scheme, like you cannot force new identities because basically you have an authority that says who you are, right? We move away from that because this is like fully on-chain identity system, although it can be like work it out. And it requires like several transactions. You need to add keys and you need to, it is not doable, at least totally not doable on a public blockchain, maybe doable on a proof of authority. But the basic idea behind on these identity systems, the IDs remains, right? And going back to your point, I think like one person, one vote is a horrible solution. Like I think that's a solution for very specific kind of issues, where you vote around values, your own values, not around like any technical or like issue that needs some knowledge, right? I'm more in favor like a fully meritocratic approach where your weight is the weight of your vote is based on the requirements of the merit. I think that's like how we should go towards to, like one person, one vote. I think that makes sense for asking like, how are you, right? That's something that only you can vote, so you can really respond to the questions on what are your values, and that probably can be extrapolated to create an idea, an abstraction of what people care. So that makes sense for me, like one person, one vote, and now we have like this global idea of like what people care, and we can take decisions. Like it's signaling mechanisms. But when it's about to take decisions about specific issues, my take is like this should be taken by the people that has knowledge about these decisions, right? And defining this merit is very complicated, but I totally think it's doable, like with like decentralized identities and like a good repetition system.
I just want to add one more point. It's first yes, that it's I think you should only be able to vote on the decision that you have knowledge about, but also it's also on the just on the issues that actually concern you. Because for example, if there's a vote coming up about how should the money, I don't know, how should the government split spending between the bicycle lanes and car roads, if I only ever go by train, that doesn't really concern me in any way. Therefore, my vote doesn't really matter as much as another person's on this particular matter. Like I might have like the same amount like of votes overall, but maybe just not on this particular issue.
I agree, and and a way to rephrase that, maybe instead of talking about merit, we should talk about, I was using the word capacities. Maybe you need to know about how like trains and cars works, but you also maybe need to be registered on this neighborhood, and maybe you have to have like the car license for the last 2 years, or maybe like you have to use like public bicycle like the last 2 years. It's like there is no real reason why you cannot quantify these things that you're asking that should be part of this merit, right? Like you can encapsulate like the complexity of what is required to vote like in a single number probably, and that's the hard part. Like that's taking all these metrics and combining them, like making a formula that at the end ends up like with like one single number.
Yeah, I just want to say like in the marketplace this works through basically like if I go to a shop and for example for me I like a particular kind of bananas, and how I express the opinions that when I go to a shop I buy this kind of bananas, and therefore with my like this one act of purchase is a vote essentially on the marketplace to explain, hey, please next time have more of these bananas because that's the kind I like. And so I think it would be interesting to have something similar in the voting space, just probably not based on money but on some similar sort of credit.
I think that's what Arwin was mentioning before to Grieve, just like where do you put your taxes is such a like powerful like mechanism for voting. Chris said that we should close up. Does anyone has an insight?
I'm going to do a conclusion by just relating this to a concept I really like, introduced by a very smart guy called Michael Nielsen, who's very interested in what he calls volitional philanthropy, which he defines as a way to increase. It's a search for how can we increase the number of ways people can act upon the world. And I think that's generally what we should tend for with like this thinking about voting. It's about how to empower people to express their opinions much better, and how to use these to then have a real impact upon the world they live in. Good.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give us a rating or comment if you enjoyed this content. This episode was brought to you by Santa and the unicorns at giveth.io. Remember, this podcast is made possible by the donations we receive from listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can do so by donating Ether at dattpodcast.com. That's DATT podcast.com. Please check the show notes for more information. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep decentralizing all the things.